The BEF, after a wretched winter in the trenches, was in no state to support a French offensive until the early spring of 1915.
We'd been brought up on histories of the Boer War and patriotism and heroics and everything, and we thought the war was going to be over before we could get there. However, in about half a minute, all that had gone. I wondered what the devil I'd got into, because it was nothing but mud and filth, and all the chaps who were already there were, well, they looked like tramps. They were all plastered in filth and dirt, unshaven.
However, knowing that the War Council in London was considering operations in the Dardanelles and Balkans, its senior commanders feared that unless the BEF made a positive contribution soon, resources might be diverted from the Western Front. The appointment of Lieutenant General Sir William Robertson as BEF's Chief of Staff in January also brought a more robust approach to the work of General Headquarters. By mid-February, a plan was approved for an attack by Haig's First Army on a narrow 2,000-yard front in Flanders. The plan was simple. The aim was to eliminate the German salient around Neuve-Chapelle and threaten Lille, an important road and rail junction. The First Army's planning provided the BEF with a valuable template for future set-piece trench assaults. Photographic reconnaissance by the Royal Flying Corps facilitated the production and distribution of detailed trench maps and enabled the assaulting units to rehearse the initial phase of the attack. For the first time, precise artillery timetables were issued, and every gun that could be spared was sent to the front to counter the German artillery.
Incidentally, every time our artillery opened up on them at that particular time, they would come back tenfold. If our artillery fired about 5 or 6 rounds, they'd fire 50 to 60 back at us.
But always it was that unequal bashing that got the infantrymen. But we couldn't, if we'd got a gun at all, we had a machine gun, it's true, but that was only a puny effort. It was these colossal shells that rained on, and we could do nothing about it.
The earthworks and the barbed wire, such as they were, had been blown to pieces long since. And the result was that practically the whole of the front line around the town of Ypres was a series of holes in which men crouched and waited for the end.
The artillery was allocated 1 million rounds, 1/6 the BEF's total stocks, and was limited to a 35-minute hurricane bombardment, following which fire would be lifted from the enemy front trenches and a barrage laid down to impede German reinforcement. On March 10th, the day of the assault, the surprised German defenders were numbed by the intense bombardment. That was an achievement rarely to be repeated. Their wire had been extensively cut, their emplacements destroyed. The attacking brigades of the Indian Corps and Rawlinson's 4 Corps swiftly took the front trenches. Within 20 minutes, a breach of 1,600 yards had been opened in the German line. The makings of a victory had been won. Unfortunately, delays on the flanks caused congestion in the center, and the German strongpoints also held up the advance, robbing the attack of its impetus. British and Indian troops had seized the German defenses on a frontage of 4,000 yards, penetrated to a maximum depth of 1,200 yards. Their advance captured Neuve-Chapelle and flattened the salient west of the village. But in the end, they could not exploit their early gains. Haig suspended the attack on March 12th after suffering 13,000 casualties. The BEF was now taken seriously as an attacking force. Neuve-Chapelle also highlighted several intrinsic problems of trench assaults. Careful preparations would generally help attackers to break the enemy position, but it was much harder to move artillery and reserves forward quickly enough to break out of these defenses before the enemy reinforcements arrived. The absence of adequate means of communication also rendered it extremely difficult for commanders to control operations once shells had destroyed forward telephone cables and runners had been killed or wounded. However, the effectiveness of the short hurricane bombardment was one lesson which the BEF, to its cost, largely ignored or discounted over the next 2 years. Before the Allies could launch their next offensive operations, the Germans struck first, employing poison gas to attack the northern flank of the Ypres salient. The first to use gas on the Western Front were the French, who fired tear gas grenades in August 1914. The quantities delivered were small, as were the effects on the Germans, who in most instances did not even notice the gas. The Germans followed by using howitzer shells containing tear gas in their bombardment at Bolimov, west of Warsaw on the Eastern Front. It was a failure, as the liquid gas failed to vaporize in the freezing temperature. However, things changed after the Germans used chemical warfare by unleashing chlorine gas against French troops at Ypres on April 22, 1915. The gas was chlorine, which kills by causing the lungs to produce fluids in which the victim drowns.
From what I have read and have seen, there was like mustard patches that they would put on their eyes. A lot, from what I understand, wasn't, was a trial and error. This was something new. No one had ever encountered it. And I really, other than I know they used mustard patches, try to ease the burning. That's all I really know about that.
The salient was important to both sides, but because Falkenhayn still accorded priority to the Eastern Front, the use of gas at Ypres was largely experimental. Thus, the objectives of 23 and 26 Reserve Corps were confined to Langemarck, Pilkem Ridge, and the Yser Canal line up to Ypres itself, while the Fourth Army was denied fresh reserves. However, the Germans hoped that the capture of the higher ground near Pilkem might render it impossible for the Allies to hold the salient. The French 45th Algerian and 87th Territorial Divisions occupied the sector between the Yser Canal and Puy-Capelle, which the Germans were to attack. Just after 5 p.m. on April 22nd, following a short but ferocious bombardment, the Germans released clouds of chlorine gas from 5,730 cylinders.
At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a very heavy bombardment started, and a little later on, we saw the effects of this. The first thing was hundreds of French troops running away. They were just like ants. They weren't sticking to roads or paths or anything else. They were all over the fields and breaking through hedges and everything. No arms, they'd all gone. They're clutching their throats and saying gas, gas, and so on.
With no protection against the gas, French divisions retreated in panic, opening a 5-mile gap to the left of the 1st Canadian Division's positions.
We tried to rally them as they got level with us, and they wouldn't stay, and all we got from them was "Alley man, bum bum, my lad, my lad." And they kept going, and we got orders to turn around and shoot them, which we did, run away from us. And momentarily we looked, and here we saw this green cloud coming along the ground.
Langemarck and Pilkem fell, and at dusk the Germans were only 2 miles from Ypres. Fortunately for the Allies, the German troops were unwilling to pursue the gas too closely, and, lacking reserves, failed to grasp their sole opportunity to effect a breakthrough in the West that year. During the night, a new defensive line was patched together by the British and Canadians. When a second gas attack came at Saint-Julien on April 24th, the Canadians, using towels, bandages, and handkerchiefs soaked in urine or water as improvised respirators, courageously prevented further erosion of the front.
One chap had his hand blown off and his wrist was fumbling round, tearing at his throat.
The effect of this gas was to form a sort of foamy liquid in one's lungs and more or less in time drown one, if you were unlucky. Because a lot of the men died pretty quickly. Others were soon down, dying. They were in fact drowning from this beastly foam coming up from their lungs.
There must have been 200 or 300 men, and they were wriggling and wreathing in all positions, tearing at their throats, their faces black. And an RAMC sergeant, he stood by there, and he looked, well, I've never seen a man look so despondent. He says, "Look at the poor bastards," he said, "we can't do anything for them."
This was now a war of chemicals and engineering. Foch, coordinating Allied operations in Flanders, did not enjoy his finest hour at Ypres in April and May 1915. His faith in the infallibility of the offensive, and ignoring the loss of guns during the German advance, he ordered the local commander to counterattack, which was plainly impractical. Various assaults by the BEF between April 23rd and 26th, made with inadequate artillery support and negligible French assistance, failed to regain lost ground.
The shelling had started again in Ypres, and by the time we got up, marching up to the town, it looked as though the whole place was on fire. Buildings right and left of us were blazing away, and the heat was so intense in some of the narrow streets that as we were marching up in column of 4, the men on the flanks had to creep into the middle to avoid the blistering heat.
On April 27th, painfully aware that German gunners could now shell the salient from the left and rear, General Smith-Dorrien urged withdrawal to a more defensible GHQ line to the east of Potsdam and Wiltje, and within 2,000 yards of Ypres. This suggestion was rejected by the mercurial Sir John French, who was in an optimistic mood following a promise of extra divisions from Foch. With his doubts about Smith-Dorrien reawakened, French immediately transferred responsibility for all British troops around Ypres to the 5th Corps commander, Herbert Plumer. This incident precipitated Smith-Dorrien's resignation, and he was succeeded in command of 2nd Army by Plumer on May 6th. The loss of the able Smith-Dorrien did not ultimately prove as calamitous to the BEF as it might have done, since Plumer displayed an almost unrivaled understanding and mastery of the new tactical conditions of the Western Front. It is ironic that between May 1st and 3rd, when demands on the imminent Artois offensive ended hopes of French reserves being sent to Ypres, Plumer was permitted to draw back his forces, much the same as Smith-Dorrien had proposed. In May, the Germans made 4 more gas attacks, seizing additional ground on the Bellewaerde and Fresenberg ridges. When the battle ended on May 25th, the Ypres salient, now less than 3 miles deep, assumed the basic form it would keep for the next 2 years. For the second time in 7 months, the BEF had halted a German drive on Ypres. This latest defense had cost another 58,000 casualties, compared with the nearly 38,000 lost by the Germans. Now, with the Germans positioned on 3 sides and holding the key ridges to the east and south, there was no relief from the enemy guns and no foreseeable end to the suffering of the BEF. The first spring of the World War brought fresh hope to the armies on all fronts. The reality of trench warfare had buried the old hopes of quick glory. The plans of the great powers, the Schlieffen Plan, Plan 17, and the Russian steamroller, were a faint memory of an innocent world passed by. The sobering reality was one of trench warfare. This style of fighting was difficult for generals to adapt to, soldiers to carry out, and disheartening to new recruits. The Germans had firmly fixed themselves on French and Belgian soil and were digging in. They constructed elaborate defensive trenches, which were hardened by the addition of machine guns and barbed wire. The logic being that guns and barbed wire saved men. Men were needed to mount new offensives and conquer more territory. Falkenhayn wanted to use a strike force to push the British off the continent while their numbers were still small. The problem with accomplishing this was that Germany's ally, Austria, was being pressed further and further back by the Tsar's massive southeastern armies. The Russians were bulldozing the hapless Habsburg army into the Carpathian passes, threatening the dual monarchy's Hungarian homeland. Falkenhayn was forced to delay his offensive against the British and send Otto von Hindenburg 3 newly raised corps. The 3 corps would form a new 10th Army under Colonel General von Eichhorn. The 8th Army, under General Otto von Below, reinforced by the 4th New Corps, would form the southern jaw of what was hoped to be a second Tannenberg.
The need for some relief to the Austrians by means of an attack in another spot became imperative. With a heavy heart, I had to make up my mind to employ my only available reserves in the east.
For the relief attack, Falkenhayn chose the Masurian Lakes region, where the Russians still held large pieces of East Prussian forests. The German plan was simple and brutal: outflank the Russians in the north and herd them south into the Augustov forest and destroy them. In January 1915, materiel and men from von Bülow's 8th Army and Eichhorn's 10th Army lined up opposite the Russian 10th Army. In temperatures below zero and blinding blizzards, the Germans took up their positions. Meanwhile, the Russians were again arguing about priorities. Ivanov cited the failures against the Germans as reason for concentration on Austria-Hungary, arguing that a convincing defeat would prompt Italy and Romania to invade it. With Russia, Italy, and Romania advancing on the dual monarchy, it would collapse, leaving Germany isolated. Ruzsky argued that Germany was the main enemy, and force used against Austria-Hungary was wasted. The Grand Duke saw a flank attack from East Prussia as the greatest threat to his planned drive on Berlin, and came down on Ruzsky's side, giving Ivanov only 1 extra corps and telling him not to attack. The bulk of Russian resources went to form a new 10th Army under General Plehve, deployed south of the 10th, to invade East Prussia from the south by passing the Masurian Lakes, while the 10th invaded from the east. Which side would be ready first depended on the railways. Here the Germans won hands down. On February 5th, documents found on a dead German officer told the Russians that East Prussia had been reinforced, but they had no time to act on the information. Their offensive could not begin until February 23rd, but the German 8th Army attacked on the 7th and the 10th on the 8th. The weather was atrocious, varying from blizzards to daytime thaws, freezing again at night, so that even though both sides' troops had winter clothing, casualties from frostbite far outnumbered those of battle. The conditions favored the defense because closing the trap required the Germans to move faster than the Russians. Movement of any kind was difficult through snowdrifts and mud, fast movement impossible, and bringing supplies from railheads took up to 12 horses per cartload. But here too, superior German organization told. By February 9th, most of the Russian artillery was out of ammunition, and under constant bombardment, the Russian 10th's northern flank crumpled. The Russian army was sent reeling backwards. Once again, as in the Battle of Tannenberg, under the weight of German steel and shells, the lumbering Russian bear was driven into massive retreat. Over the course of a 10-day period, the Russian muzhiki stumbled through the unforgiving winter to escape the German pincers, but continuously were forced southward into the Augustov forest, where they were surrounded and captured or killed. By February 17th, the Germans had taken over 60,000 prisoners and had another 70,000 trapped in the Augusto forest. The Germans were now nearing exhaustion, and Russian counterattacks in the last days of February prompted Hindenburg to end the offensive and pull back from the most exposed positions. By the end of March, another 40,000 Russians had been captured, and the front was stable just east of the frontier. The Russians had lost 150,000 in prisoners alone and 3/4 of the 10th Army's 396 guns. But the grander aim of forcing Russia to abandon the Vistula line had not been achieved, and the accompanying Austro-Hungarian offensive failed. The Russian public did not know Hindenburg's aim or that he fell short of achieving it. They knew only that another army had been wiped out, and that soldiers' letters spoke of overwhelming German artillery bombardment, Russian guns silent for lack of shells, and infantry mowed down or captured by the tens of thousands. In 1914, the Russian Chief of Staff had written to the Minister of War,
"The men are saying, why should we perish of hunger and cold, without boots? The artillery is silent, and we are killed like partridges."
While the bravery of the Russian muzhiki could compete with the Germans, output of war materiel could not. Before the outbreak of hostilities, Russia's main trading partner was Germany. Given the state of war, trade was impossible, and Russia suffered mightily for it. The Russian factories were only able to supply artillery divisions with about 1/2 of the 50,000 shells needed per day. Shells which could have saved men for a strike force or rear guard. Prisoners of the Germans lambasted their Cossack liberators.
"Who asked you to rescue us? Fools! We don't want to hunger and freeze again."
Despite cold and shortages, the Russian army was still making headway in the south and Galicia. The Tsar's army continually thrust the Austrians back deeper towards Hungary's eastern border. The last Austrian defense before the open Hungarian plains was the fortress of Przemyśl. The Russians had laid siege to the fortress for better than 3 months, starting in the winter of 1915. Przemyśl was growing short on food. Cats, dogs, and horses were being slaughtered. The Austrians, sensing the situation becoming desperate, on March 20th decided to make one last attempt to break out. They failed, and the Russians accepted an Austrian surrender of Przemyśl on March 22nd. In that surrender, the Russians took 107,000 prisoners, 20,000 of them sick and wounded. Austria's military incompetence continued to vex Falkenhayn.
The appeals of the Austrians for assistance never ceased. Symptoms of disintegration became more and more evident in formations of Czech and Southern Slav recruits.
Again, the Germans had to come to the aid of the decrepit Habsburg Empire against the Russians. More importantly, they had to forestall Italian and Romanian intervention. Both wanted territorial concessions. Falkenhayn opted to overawe them by crippling Russia's offensive power. He planned a surprise attack on the Russian Third Army over a 78-mile front between Tarnov in the north and the Lupka Pass in the south. Its focal point was the city of Gorlice Tarnov. After rupturing Russian defenses, the German High Command sought to seize enemy communications of the army that threatened the Hungarian plain. Field Marshal August von Mackensen, one of the heroes of the Battle of Tannenberg, was selected to lead the charge. He was given command of the German 11th Army and the Austrian 4th Army. Mackensen understood his goal.
The 11th Army must make quick forward progress. This is of fundamental importance. Only in speed lies the guarantee that we should be able to stop the enemy from bringing his reserves.
To aid Mackensen in this goal was the familiar howitzer battering ram. As May 1915 opened along the Russian front, the Central Powers had amassed some 170,000 men and over 1,000 guns. Unlike the Russians, the Germans rarely worried about ammunition shortages, Falkenhayn wrote.
By the spring of 1915, General Headquarters was relieved of any serious anxiety with regard to munition supply.
The Germans struck on May 2nd and achieved almost complete surprise. From 6 to 10 in the morning, the howitzer battering ram smashed Russian defenses to pieces. Then the lightning attack went in. A German soldier recalled,
"Neither fire, nor trenches, nor barbed wire could stop the assault, although our ranks became thinner and thinner. After 35 minutes, and despite the tropical heat, we reached the enemy. The Russians clung ferociously to their trenches, but in another 10 minutes the job was finished."
Mackensen signaled the Kaiser.
I report to your majesty that the order to make the enemy's positions in the Carpathians untenable has been carried out. The enemy is in retreat along the whole line.
On the other side of the attack, a Russian commander wrote, "The retreat from Galicia was one vast tragedy for the Russian army. No cartridges, no shells, bloody fighting and difficult marching day after day, no end of weariness, physical and moral, faint hopes followed by sinister dread. For 11 days, the German heavy artillery swept away whole lines of our trenches, and their defenders with them. We hardly replied. There was nothing to reply with." An urgent message was sent to the Tsar in Petrograd. "There are no rifles. 150,000 men are without rifles. From hour to hour it is worse. We await the heavenly manner from you." By May 3rd, Gorlice had been taken, and a 12-mile hole ripped in Radko Dmitriev's line. 3 of the divisions broke and fled. The rest were down to an average of only 1,000 men by evening on the 4th of May. The only option for the battered Russian army was to withdraw behind the Vistula. By May 10th, Radko Dmitriev reported that the Third Army had bled to death. Falkenhayn saw the victory important enough to transfer the supreme command from the west to Silesia and plan a joint Austro-German effort to cripple Russia permanently. On May 25th, Italy did indeed declare war, and the Austrians began leaving for the Italian front on June 3rd, with the Germans taking their place against the Russians. By the 1st of June, Mackensen's troops marched triumphantly back into the fortress of Przemyśl. The fortress had been in Russian possession for only 2 months. The combined German and Austrian army had marched more than 100 miles in the heat of the Galician summer to take back the fort. The Russian retreat was total and immense along the Galician frontier. By now, Russian losses were soaring. In May alone, the Southwest Front lost 412,000 killed, wounded, or captured. To those that had withstood the howitzer battering ram and the lightning attack of Mackensen's army, it was a miracle to be alive. In the prison camps, the Russians reveled as they believed their struggle against German steel was finally over. Without the Germans, the Austrians could not achieve victory against the Russians. But fighting alongside and with German leadership, the Austro-Hungarian army was able to retake the captured fortress of Przemyśl and recapture the 4th largest city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Lemberg. With the help of Germany, the Austrians were able to march some 150 miles into Russian territory and inflict more than 500,000 casualties. The Central Powers looked unstoppable in the east, in Falkenhayn's estimation.
Immediate and highly valuable consequences. But enough had not yet been achieved. It was clear that any breaking off of the operations in the east was out of the question.
For Falkenhayn and his general staff, the real question was how to exploit the series of Central Power victories. As the bulk of Russian troops were surrounding a salient around Warsaw, Falkenhayn saw his chance to encircle from the north and the south and take Warsaw. The bitter fighting defending Warsaw briefly gave hope to the Russian masses, but eventually the city fell on August 5th. The defeats at Gorlice Tarnów, Lemberg, and especially Warsaw were more devastating than the Battle of Tannenberg. 15 divisions were completely wiped out, and 20 more reduced to skeletons. The situation was growing worse by the day. The Russian chief of staff reported to the French ambassador,
In several infantry regiments, at least 1/3 of the men had no rifle. These poor devils had to wait patiently under a shower of shrapnel until their comrades fell before their eyes and they could pick up their arms.
One Russian commander lamented, "Our army is drowning in its own blood." Falkenhayn, recognizing the dire situation facing the Tsar's army, took the opportunity to put out peace overtures to the Tsar. But they were rejected. The situation on the Russian home front continued to deteriorate.
Disorders in Moscow have been particularly serious. The agitation assumed such a scale that it had become necessary to suppress it by force. On the famous Red Square, the mob insulted the royal family, demanded that the Empress should be incarcerated in a convent and the Emperor deposed.
The Tsar, autocrat to the end, paid no attention. In September, he took personal control of the army, saying,
"We shall fulfill our sacred duty to defend our country to the last. We will not dishonor the Russian land."
And so the bloodletting continued. The German armies under von Hindenburg broke out in the north and pressed deep into the Russian heartland. Cities like Brest-Litovsk, Kovno, and Białystok fell to the juggernaut of an army. The Russians could do nothing to stop them. A giddy Kaiser wrote, "My victorious sword has crushed the Russians. Woe to them that yet draw the sword against me." The expedition into the Russian heartland brought an already suffering population even more hardships. The agony of the empire was hitting closer and closer to home. The furthest German advance got some 325 miles eastward and captured over 1,000 guns. The losses in men were an appalling 2 million. Not even the vast Russian Empire could keep up with losses like these. The largest army in Europe was on the brink of total collapse. The suffering Russians could only wonder, where are our allies? As the Russian lines continued to melt in front of the hot steel of German artillery, the conquest of the Balkans by the Central Powers was beginning in the fall of 1915. The Serbians begged for Allied help as the howitzer battering ram lined up along her northern border to rain shells down on the Serb defenses. But sending help to the landlocked country in the heart of the Balkan Mountains was going to be more difficult than first thought. The best way to help Serbia looked to be through her southerly neighbor, Greece. Greek Premier Venizelos agreed to allow 150,000 British and French troops to land at Salonika and mobilized his own army to come to Serbia's aid in exchange for territory on the Serbian border. Salonika was chosen because of its excellent natural harbor, its many railroads that led north, and its distance of only 50 miles from the Serbian border. The 1st Division of French troops landed at Salonika on October 5th. However, That very day, the premier Venizelos was dismissed by King Constantine. The monarch, whose brother-in-law was Kaiser Wilhelm II, also announced that Greece would remain neutral and not assist the Serbs. A British division was moved from Gallipoli to follow the French. The situation was strange and difficult for the Allies to reconcile. A British newspaper reported,
"The German spies sit in rows on the quays at Salonika, smoking large cigars, and note down every man, horse, gun, and ton of stores landed. This is a nice way to make war."
On October 5th, the Austrians and Germans began shelling the Serbian defenses. Then the Central Power troops crossed south over the Danube and Sava rivers. The next day, Belgrade came under attack, and the British naval gunners fought to the end as the capital fell on the 9th after savage street fighting, costing the Austrians 7,000 casualties. On October 11th, Serbia's neighbor to the east, Bulgaria, flanked the Serbians' right, and thus entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. The Bulgarians' motive for attacking Serbia was quite elementary. Long-standing regional rivalries fueled a lust for Serbian territory. The battles between Serbia and Bulgaria displayed the very worst peasant and soldier had to offer. The bitter fighting was a result of cherished mutual hatred. The combat was very much a continuation of hostilities which took place during the Second Balkan War, fought in 1913, which pitted Bulgaria against the entire Balkan Peninsula. The Serbs were able to score a couple of small victories against the Bulgarians in the east and the Austrians in the west. But the breaking point was the north, where the Serbs were unable to stop the advancing German 11th Army. When the Bulgarians eventually captured the southern region of Macedonia in late October, the Serbians were forced to stage a fighting retreat southwest through Albania. An English naval officer observed the retreat.
Here was no orderly march of troops. They crawled at snail's pace, staggering, bent to the ground, supporting themselves on sticks. Many were without cap or boots, and their clothes hung on them in rags. Some who were too weak to walk alone were helped along by friends. Many were dying of sheer hunger, exposure, fatigue, and the last stages of dysentery. Here and there was a huddled heap upon the ground, the body of some lad too weak to walk further, who'd turned aside to die. The haunting thing was that their faces were all exactly alike. Starvation had reduced them all to the same mask of pain.
Following the army's retreat was that of the civilian population, who feared reprisals from bitter Austrian and Bulgarian armies. As 1915 drew to a close, 1/6 of Serbia's population had been killed. 100,000 of her 400,000-man army were all that was left standing. The Serb retirement continued. Morale was still high. Men were flocking to enlist, and the fighting qualities of the Serb army remained as strong as ever, but they were steadily forced to give ground. The great arsenal of Kragujevac was abandoned and blown up on November 1st. As Mitrovica and Pristina fell on November 23rd, the surviving 200,000 Serbian troops faced a nightmare march over mountains in the grip of winter to safety on the Adriatic coast. The Serbian rear guard was overwhelmed on the White Drin River, losing masses of precious supplies in the process as the retreat went on in a dreadful winter. The only help that the Allies could give to the survivors was to ferry the displaced Serbs from Albania across the Adriatic to the island of Corfu. The fall of Serbia was emblematic of the difficult year that was 1915 for the Allies. The Central Powers were running amok in the east and on the Balkan Peninsula, not to mention the ground still occupied in France and Belgium. As Joffre convened a Supreme Allied meeting in early December 1915, a plan was devised to attack the Central Powers on 3 fronts: the Russian, Italian, and Franco-British simultaneously. The attack was designed so as not to allow the enemy to bring up reserves. As 1915 drew to a close, things looked bleak for the Allies, but with a new year brings new hope. Hope for the displaced people feeling the pressure of global war. Hope for victorious battles. Events on the Eastern Front made the projected Allied spring offensive in Artois even more significant as a means of giving indirect help to the Russians. Joffre and Foch proposed that in Artois, after a prodigious 6-day preliminary bombardment by 1,252 guns, the French 10th Army would assault Vimy Ridge to open the way for an advance into the Doual Plain. When the offensive began on May 9th, Petain's 33rd Corps, attacking in the crucial central sector, achieved early successes beyond expectations. In 90 minutes, his troops moved forward 2.5 miles on a 4-mile front, and the 77th and Moroccan divisions reached the crest of Vimy Ridge between Souchez and La Folie Farm. The drawback was that because d'Herbal had not anticipated such a swift advance, his nearest reserves were over 7 miles away and could not be brought up in time to exploit these successes. Inevitably, by nightfall, the Germans had counterattacked and pushed Petain's troops off the crest. From that point on, the offensive degenerated into a bitter, close-quarters struggle in the labyrinth of German strong points and trenches on or below the ridge. As the grisly specter of attrition reimposed itself, the French made a few extra gains, securing much of the vital neighboring spur of Notre-Dame-de-Lorette. On June 16th, the impressive Moroccan division again reached the top of Vimy Ridge, but as before, could not hold on to all of its gain. 5 weeks of fighting had cost an additional 100,000 French casualties, while German losses totaled some 60,000. All that Joffre and Foch could show for this sacrifice was the recapture of 5 more miles of French soil and a precarious toehold on Vimy Ridge. The BEF's part in the offensive operations on May 9th was a larger-scale version of its own March assault, with Haig's First Army attacking either side of Neuve-Chapelle in a fresh effort to secure Aubers Ridge. The success of the short bombardment in March was borne in mind, but the BEF's worrying shortage of heavy guns and ammunition limited the preliminary bombardment to 45 minutes.
We were in a battery of 15-pounders, 4 guns, and consistently short of ammunition, being allowed 4 rounds per day for registering, etc. As the intensity of the battle grew to May the 24th, we ran completely out of ammunition and were left there absolutely helpless.
As the German defenses in this sector had strengthened since March, the bombardment was simply not heavy enough.
Half of us were knocked out, either killed or wounded. And going across the meadow, there were a lot more killed. And we all stopped and laid down, trying to get what shelter we could from the tremendous rifle fire which was coming over. And then a sergeant just in front of me jumped up and said, "Come on, men, be British." We jumped up and followed him, and he ran about 6 yards and he went down. Well, we ran on about another 20 yards toward the German trenches. The German trenches were literally packed. They were standing about 4 deep, firing machine guns, rifles straight at us.
With plenty of time to emerge from their dugouts and man their trench parapets relatively unscathed, the defenders inflicted 11,000 casualties for only tiny British gains, compelling Haig to terminate the attack early on May 10th. Between May 15th and 27th, the BEF incurred 16,000 casualties for a maximum advance of some 1,300 yards, just enough to encourage future reliance on longer artillery bombardments before infantry attacks. In coming to believe that wearing out fights, longer and heavier bombardments, and wider attack frontages would be needed for any breakthrough, the French and the British alike had drawn several misleading conclusions from the May battles, and would then follow a series of costly and false tactical trails over the next 2 years. Elsewhere on the front, the French made an abortive attempt to eradicate the potential threat posed to the eastern flank of Verdun by the German-hailed Saint-Mihiel salient, incurring 64,000 casualties in the process. Another 32,000 French officers and men fell in the Argonne sector from June 20th to July 14th. Meanwhile, the Germans continued to experiment with new weapons. After first using flamethrowers near Verdun in February, they subjected the raw British 14th Division to a terrifying liquid fire attack at Hooge near Ypres on July 30th. Sir John French was swept away by the recriminations over the handling of the reserves during the disastrous Battle of Loos in September. The British lost another 50,000 men, and the French 48,000 for trifling gains. German overall total losses was about 56,000 men. French was succeeded as Commander-in-Chief of the BEF by Douglas Haig on December 19th. The battles of 1915 on the Western Front had established that methodical planning and limited offensives were necessary to kill the maximum number of Germans. By the end of 1915, the Germans were moving away from the columns and skirmish lines of 1914 and were training special assault detachments or storm troops, which had their own flamethrowers, light artillery, and mortars for close fire support, and advanced independently to deal with enemy strongpoints. In 1916, they would put them to devastating use.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we picture the poor civilian sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Oh, to be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as Reveille is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Home for the right turn, how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, to be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up till the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. What? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? For us, retard, we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Come to the cookhouse door, boys, sniff at the lovely stew. Oh, as it says the colonel gets better grub than you. Any complaints this morning? Do we complain? Not we. What's the matter with lumps of onion floating around your tea? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley has gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed.